bucket of milk. That's all that stood between Marin Calloway and watching her children starve to death before Christmas. The ranch was dying. The debts were real. And the man circling her land like a vulture, Gideon Voss, had already counted her out. Then a stranger walked out of the storm with nothing but an axe and an offer so strange it should have sent her running. What happened next didn't just save one family, it changed an entire frontier forever. If this story moves you, comment your city, and let's see how far this goes. The wind came down from the mountains the way bad news always does. Without warning, without mercy, and far too early in the season. Marin Calloway felt it before she heard it. A pressure shift in the air, a drop in temperature that pressed against the skin like a cold hand laid flat against the back of her neck. She was standing at the kitchen window, watching the last amber light drain out of the western sky, when the first real gust hit the side of the house and rattled every loose board from the porch rail to the chimney stack. She didn't flinch. She'd stopped flinching at things she couldn't change sometime around August, when the creek had dried to mud and the last of the summer calves had turned out sickly and small. What she did was turn back to the stove and stare at the pot sitting there with almost nothing in it. Potato broth. Thin enough to read scripture through, her mother used to say. And she'd said it as a joke, back when there was something to joke about. There wasn't much to joke about anymore. Mama. The voice came from the doorway, small, careful, the way a child's voice gets careful when they've learned that certain questions make their mother's face do something they don't like to see. Marin turned. Her daughter Clara was standing at the edge of the kitchen holding a wooden spoon she'd been using to stir something imaginary, the way 8-year-olds do when they're trying to look busy and unbothered. Supper ready soon? Few more minutes, Marin said. She kept her voice even. She'd gotten good at that too. Clara nodded and disappeared back around the corner, and a moment later Marin heard her younger brother Eli's voice murmuring something low, and Clara's answering him in the patient, older sister way she'd developed over the past year. A tone that broke Marin's heart every single time she heard it, because no 8-year-old should have to speak to her brother that way. That was a mother's tone, a woman's tone. And Clara had borrowed it without being asked, because she'd understood somewhere along the way that her mother was running out of things to give. Marin turned back to the window. Outside, the ranch lay in the failing dark like something already half dead. The fence along the north pasture had been down since September. 3 rails collapsed by a tree limb that had come off the big cottonwood during a freak early storm. She hadn't had the tools to fix it properly, or the hands. The barn roof was warped along the eastern pitch, which meant the 2 remaining milk cows spent wet nights shifting and lowing with discomfort. And wet cows gave less milk, and less milk meant she had less to sell at Hadley's general store in town, and less to sell meant less to put toward the debt ledger that Gideon Voss's man brought out every first Monday of the month, like a priest delivering bad sacrament. Her husband Daniel had built this place with his hands. 14 years of his life were in the posts, and the beams, and the stone foundation that ran under the main house. He'd died 3 winters back from a fever that moved too fast, and she hadn't been prepared. Nobody ever was, no matter how often the frontier reminded you that it didn't much care about your plans. She'd tried to keep it together. Lord knew she'd tried. But the winter coming down from those mountains right now was going to be the worst one yet. She could feel it in her bones the way Daniel used to say the old-timers claimed, and she'd always laughed at that. And now she understood every word of it. The bucket sitting by the door held about 3 inches of milk. That was all that was left after she'd pulled what she could from the cows this afternoon. 3 inches of milk, a pot of potato broth thin enough to float a prayer on, half a loaf of bread she'd been rationing since Tuesday, and a shelf that held a jar of dried beans, a small bag of cornmeal, and a can of lard so old she wasn't entirely sure it was still good. That was winter. That was what she had to offer her children. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window and breathed out slow. She needed to figure out the north fence. She needed to get the barn roof looked at before the snow hit and the whole pitch gave. She needed feed for the animals she still had. She needed so many things that when she let herself count them all at once, her chest went tight, and she had to stop and just breathe and think about one thing at a time, because that was the only way to keep moving. One thing at a time. The fence. She'd deal with the fence tomorrow. Find something to prop those rails with, even if it wasn't a proper fix. Keep the cows from wandering in the night. That was the thought she was holding when she heard the dog. Biscuit was their old shepherd mix, black and gray at the muzzle now, mostly deaf in one ear. He'd stopped being much of a working dog 2 years back, but he stayed close to the house, and he still had the instincts, even if the hearing was going. He was somewhere out near the porch, and he wasn't barking, which meant it wasn't a coyote or something wild. It was a person. Biscuit's bark for strangers was different, lower. It started in the chest. Marin heard that bark now. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and took the rifle down from the hook beside the door. Not because she was the kind of woman who reached for a gun at the first sign of something unexpected, but because she was the kind of woman who'd learned, the hard way, and more than once, that the frontier had a particular fondness for arriving on your doorstep, right when you could least afford a problem. She worked the bolt, confirmed the round was chambered, and opened the door. The cold hit her straight in the face. The wind had teeth now, real teeth, coming down off the mountain with a high-pitched sound that bent through the cottonwood branches and scattered something dry and dead across the porch boards. The man was standing about 20 yards out, in the gap between the barn and the near fence line. He'd stopped moving when Biscuit planted himself between them, and he wasn't making any sudden gestures, which Marin registered as either good sense or experience with being greeted this way. His hands were visible. One held a long-handled axe by the base of the head, carried down at his side. The other was open, palm slightly out, not raised in the theatrical way men did when they were performing surrender. Just open. Easy. He was big. Not in an inflated way, not the kind of big that's mostly chest and swagger. The kind of big that comes from years of work that doesn't stop because the weather gets hard. His coat was heavy canvas, dark with use, and there was a bedroll and pack lashed high on his shoulders. A trapper's rig. She could see the shape of snowshoes strapped alongside, and a canvas-wrapped bundle that, from the stiff angular way it held its shape, was almost certainly pelts. He had a beard that had gone past deliberate and into simple function. His hat was a wide-brimmed felt one, dark, with the left brim bent up the way they got when a man slept in them outdoors. Under it, in the dim last light, she could see a face that wasn't young anymore and hadn't been soft for a very long time. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said. His voice carried without him raising it, the voice of someone used to being heard across distance. "Saw your light from the ridge. Figured I'd come down and ask if you've got a place I can sleep out of the wind." "You figured wrong," Marin said. The rifle wasn't raised, but her grip on it was clear and deliberate. "I don't take in strangers." He didn't argue with that. Didn't offer an explanation or try to charm her around it. Just nodded once, slow, like he was filing the information away. "Fair enough," he said. He turned. Actually turned, and started walking back toward the tree line. The dog watched him go with that low sound still humming in his chest, and Marin stood in the doorway with the wind pushing at her back from inside the house, and she told herself she was making the right call. Told herself it wasn't her problem. What happened to a trapper out in that dark, with the temperature dropping and a bad mountain winter rolling in from the north? She'd almost made it back inside when something caught her eye. The north fence line. In the last gray light, she could just make out the 3 rails that were down, the gap she'd been worrying over all afternoon. And the man, the stranger, had walked right past it. He'd stopped. She could see him standing at the fence line, looking at the downed rails. He stood there for a moment. Then he set his pack down in the grass, set the axe carefully against it, and bent down to look at the fence post more closely. Marin watched him from the doorway, one hand on the frame. He wasn't doing anything, just looking. Then he straightened up and turned back toward the house. And even in the bad light, she could tell he wasn't walking toward her aggressively. He was keeping his distance, stopping about the same 20 yards as before. "Your post's rotted at the base," he called. "You prop those rails tonight, they'll just come down again in a week." "I know that," she said. "I can fix it properly. The post, the rails, I got tools." "I told you I don't take in strangers." "Didn't ask to come in," he said. "I'll sleep in your barn if you'll allow it. Out of the wind, that's all I'm asking. And for that, I'll fix your fence right, before the snow comes and the ground freezes too hard to set a new post." Marin looked at him. She looked at the fence. She thought about the cows, about wet nights and cold mornings, and the milk getting thinner week by week. She thought about Clara's face at the window of the kitchen, careful and patient, and Eli trying not to ask whether supper was ready because he'd learned that asking made his mother's eyes do something he didn't want to be responsible for. "You hungry?" she said. A pause. Brief. Like the question surprised him. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "There's broth," she said. "It's thin. And there's bread, but not much of it." "Broth's fine." She stood there a moment longer, the rifle still in her hand, the wind pressing at her back. "What's your name?" "Boone," he said. "Boone Mercer." "Marin Calloway." She stepped back from the doorway, just slightly. Not an invitation, not quite, but an opening. "You bring that axe inside, you leave it by the door where I can see it." "Understood," he said. He ate the broth at the far end of the kitchen table while Clara and Eli watched him from the doorway with the particular intensity that children reserve for unexpected things. He didn't try to win them over, didn't make faces at them or say anything big and cheerful about what good kids they looked like. He just ate, carefully, without scraping the bowl or making noise about it. After a while, Eli drifted a little closer, the way 6-year-olds do when curiosity outweighs caution, and looked at the axe leaning against the wall by the door. "That's a big axe," Eli said. "It is," Boone said. "What do you use it for?" "Mostly wood." Boone pulled a piece of bread from the small piece Marin had put on the table beside the bowl. "Sometimes trail clearing. Build a shelter if I need to." "You build shelters?" "When there's nothing else." Eli considered this. "Out in the woods?" "Mostly, yeah." "By yourself?" Boone looked at the boy directly for the first time. Something crossed his face. Not pain exactly, but something close to it. Something that moved through and settled. "Mostly," he said. Clara, who had been watching all of this from the doorway with 8-year-old assessment running behind her eyes, said, "Do you have kids?" The question landed in the kitchen and sat there. Marin, who was washing the pot at the basin, went still. Boone set the bread down. "I do," he said. "Where are they?" "Clara," Marin said quietly. "It's all right." Boone looked at Clara evenly. "They're staying with their grandmother, up near the northern pass, while I work." "How long have they been there?" Clara asked. "Too long," he said. And then he picked up the bread again, and that was the end of it. He slept in the barn. She'd told him where the clean straw was and where the lantern hook was, and she'd brought out a blanket that was patched but thick, and he'd thanked her for it without making a production of either the thank you or the fact that the blanket had holes in it. She lay awake for a long time that night, not afraid exactly. She'd taken the rifle to bed with her, and Biscuit had settled outside the barn with a resigned sort of watchfulness that told her the dog had made his own assessment and come down cautiously somewhere in the direction of tolerance. She lay awake because she was thinking about what Clara had asked, and about the look on Boone's face when he'd answered. Too long. She knew that sound. She'd had it in her own voice for 3 years. Basket. He had the fence post out before she'd gotten the fire going in the morning. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee. Real coffee. The last of what she had. She'd made it thin. And watched him work in the gray pre-dawn light. He'd found a replacement post somewhere, or possibly fashioned one, she couldn't tell from here, and he was setting it with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd done this kind of work so many times it had gone past skill and into something closer to instinct. No wasted movement, no standing back to admire progress. Just the next step, and then the next one after that. By the time the children were up and had eaten cornmeal porridge, she'd found a little more cornmeal at the back of the shelf than she'd thought, which felt like a small miracle of the most practical variety. Boone had the fence rails seated on the new post and was tamping the base with the heel of his boot. He came to the door when she called that there was coffee and porridge. "The windmill," he said, before he'd even sat down. "The brake's sticking. If the wind kicks up hard and it can't turn free, it'll blow the tail or strip the gears." Marin looked at him. "I know," she said. "I've been hand-pumping for 3 weeks." He nodded. 8. Didn't say anything else about it, but after he finished, he went to the windmill. That was the first day. By the end of the third day, she'd stopped tracking what he was doing with active anxiety and started to simply register the sound of work somewhere on the property as a new constant, like the wind or the creek. He fixed the windmill break. He split and stacked 2 cords of firewood from the deadfall timber along the eastern ridge that she hadn't been able to get to on her own. He found a weakness in the barn roof she hadn't known about and addressed it with spare lumber he'd turned up in the lean-to behind the barn. Lumber Daniel had stockpiled and she'd forgotten was there. He wasn't cheerful about any of it. He wasn't grim either. He just worked. At meals, she started asking him questions. Not personal ones, practical ones. What he thought about the weather, whether the mountain passes would close early this year, what he'd seen from the ridgeline coming down. He answered in full sentences but without extra words, the way a man talks, who spent months at a stretch with no one to talk to and has learned that words aren't something to waste. On the 4th evening, he sat at the table after supper, mending a piece of harness leather that had split, while Clara sat across from him doing her letters on a slate board. Eli had fallen asleep on the rug by the stove. The fire was going properly for the first time in weeks. Boone had found that one of the damper plates had warped and was choking the draw, and had straightened it with a rock and a piece of pipe. And the kitchen was actually warm. Genuinely warm. Marin sat down across from them both with her mending and listened to Clara asking Boone whether the letter E always went the same direction or if you could write it backwards sometimes. And Boone saying that he supposed you could write it any way you liked, but the school teacher would probably have opinions about it. And Clara saying that their school teacher was Mrs. Hennessy and she definitely had opinions. And Boone saying that sounded about right. Marin looked at her daughter's face, turned up toward this stranger at her kitchen table. Open and easy, in a way it hadn't been for a long time, and she felt something pull tight in her chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with how much she'd missed this. The ordinary weight of an evening, the sound of a fire drawing properly and someone else's voice in the room. She looked back down at her mending before Boone could look up and see her face. Us. On the 5th morning, he was already up when she came into the kitchen. He'd restarted the fire and there was water heating on the stove. He was sitting at the table with his hands around a tin cup, staring at nothing, and for a moment before he heard her come in, she caught a look on his face that she recognized in the same way you recognize weather you've already lived through. He heard her step, and it was gone. "Thought I'd ride into town today," he said. "See what's needed. Couple things I can't do without the right materials." Marin stopped. "Boone." She said his name for the first time, and something shifted slightly in his face at the sound of it. "I can't—" She stopped. Tried again. "Whatever you're thinking of buying, I don't have money to pay you back for it." He looked at her steadily. "Didn't ask you to," he said. "I'm not a charity case." "No," he said. "You're not." "Then why—" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood, and one of the cows lowed from the barn, low and comfortable, the sound of an animal that had been warm and dry for enough nights in a row to remember what comfortable felt like. "You fed me," he said. "First night. Thin broth and bread you didn't have much of. You fed me anyway." He looked at the cup in his hands. "I don't take things for nothing. Never have." Marin looked at him across the kitchen in the early light. "That was one meal," she said quietly. "You've been working 5 days." "I know," he said, "but I'm going to keep working." He set the cup down and stood up. "There's a debt I intend to make good on before I'm done here." She wanted to argue. The part of her that had spent 3 years refusing to be the woman that people pitied wanted to push back on it, say something proud and decisive. But the roof wasn't done yet, and the winter was coming, and her children were warm for the first time in weeks, and her water pump was working again, so she let him go to town. And while he was gone, she sat at the kitchen table with the account ledger Daniel had kept, running numbers that still didn't work no matter how many times she ran them, and she tried to remember what it had felt like to believe that things could be anything other than impossible. She was still sitting there when she heard his horse in the yard late that afternoon. She heard him unload something from the saddlebags, heard him go to the barn. She went to the window. He'd brought feed, proper winter feed, the kind she hadn't been able to afford since October, and lumber for the barn, and a bag of salt that he was carrying toward the lean-to on one shoulder like it weighed nothing. Marin stood at the window with one hand pressed flat against the cold glass and the numbers still not adding up on the page behind her. She didn't know this man. She didn't know why he was doing this. She didn't know whether she trusted him completely or what she would do when he eventually left, as he would. As everyone did. What she knew was that something had shifted on this property in the past 5 days. Something small and stubborn and not yet large enough to name. She turned away from the window and went back to the stove, where Eli was already pulling at her sleeve asking if Boone was back, and could he show him how to carry the feed sacks the way the big men did. "Go ask him yourself," she said. And she listened to her son run out the back door into the cold afternoon, calling the stranger's name without any fear in his voice at all. The second week started with a problem Boone hadn't expected. Not with the ranch. The ranch was coming along in the slow, unglamorous way that real work progresses. One fixed thing revealing the next broken thing underneath it. A cycle Boone understood well enough not to be frustrated by. The problem was smaller than a fence post and considerably harder to address. The problem was that he'd started looking forward to supper. Not the food specifically, though Marin was a better cook than her supplies had any right to produce. It was the hour itself. The way the kitchen filled up in the evening, Clara's slate board scratching against the table, Eli dragging things in from outside that he'd collected during the day and presenting them for examination, a pine cone with an unusual shape, a smooth river stone, a feather that he was convinced belonged to something rare and possibly dangerous. The fire going properly now. The particular sound of the damper working right. Boone had been alone for the better part of 2 years. Not entirely alone, but there were trading posts, other trappers, the occasional stretch in a town when he needed to resupply, but alone in the way that mattered, which is the way you're alone when there's no one who expects you to come back. He needed to be careful about that, about settling into warmth that wasn't his. He was splitting firewood in the side yard on the morning of the 8th day, working through a rhythm that he could maintain for hours when he heard hoofbeats on the road, not the soft irregular sound of a horse picking its own way, organized hoofbeats, the kind that come from a group of animals being ridden with intention. He set the axe down and turned around. 3 riders came through the gate without slowing. They were well mounted and they knew it, the kind of horses that cost more than most men in this territory made in a year. The men on them wore range coats that were too clean for working cowboys, and the one in front, bigger than the other 2, with a jaw like a barn beam and pale eyes that moved over the property with the assessing look of a man accustomed to calculating what things were worth, pulled up about 10 feet from Boone and looked down at him from the saddle. "Where's the widow?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Inside," Boone said. The man looked at Boone the way men like him look at things they haven't accounted for, with a brief irritation, like finding an unexpected piece of furniture in a room you were planning to walk through quickly. "Who are you?" "Boone Mercer?" He didn't offer anything else. "I'm Gideon Voss." He said the name the way a man says something he expects to produce a reaction. "I have business with Mrs. Calloway." "Then you can ride up to the house and knock on the door," Boone said. Voss looked at him for another moment. Something moved in those pale eyes. Not anger exactly. More like the slight recalibration of a man who's used to doors opening before he reaches them, confronted with one that isn't moving. He turned his horse toward the house without another word. Boone watched them go. Then he picked up the axe and followed at a distance that was close enough to be present and far enough not to be theatrical about it. Marin had heard the horses. She was standing at the open door when Voss rode up, her hands at her sides, and the look on her face told Boone everything about the history between these 2 people without a word being said. It was the face of someone who has been bracing for a particular impact for so long that when it finally arrives, there's almost a grim relief in it. "Gideon," she said. "Marin." He swung down from the saddle and handed his reins to one of the other men without looking at them. He had a leather satchel under his arm. "Cold for November." "What do you want?" He smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that's a tool, like a draw knife. "Just checking in. Making sure you're getting along all right out here." His eyes moved past her to the interior of the house, then moved around the yard, taking in the stacked firewood, the repaired fence line, the windmill turning freely in the morning breeze. Something shifted in his face. "Looks like you've had some help." "I have." His eyes found Boone, who had come around the corner of the house and stopped in the yard at a comfortable distance, axe in hand. "Mercer," Voss said. His tone had changed, flattened. Voss, Boone said. Marin looked between them. You two know each other? We've crossed paths, Voss said smoothly. He opened the satchel and drew out a folded document. I'm not here to cause trouble, Marin. I'm here because the Hadley County Bank has asked me to convey that the note on this property comes due the 15th of January. That's 11 weeks. He held the document out. She took it. The balance outstanding is $412. The number dropped into the morning air like a stone into still water. Boone watched Marin's face. She didn't look at the document. She already knew the number. He could see that. She'd known it and been carrying it, and the only thing the paper did was make it official in front of witnesses. I know what I owe, she said quietly. I know you do. Voss put the satchel back under his arm. I want you to know that I've spoken with the bank on your behalf. As a courtesy. They've agreed to accept a deed transfer in lieu of payment, which means you wouldn't face a public foreclosure. You and the children would have until spring to relocate. A deed transfer, Marin repeated. To me, yes. I'd give you fair value for the personal property. The furniture, the animals, the equipment. You'd leave with something in your pocket. I'd leave without my land. You'd leave without debt, Voss said. There's a difference. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Eli appeared at the door behind Marin, looked out at the men and horses with wide eyes, and Marin put her hand back without looking and found his shoulder and held it. I need time to think, she said. Of course. Voss stepped back toward his horse. But 11 weeks goes fast in winter. He swung up into the saddle and gathered the reins, and his eyes went to Boone one more time. They stayed there for a moment, assessing, calculating, the way those eyes did everything. Nice to see you're keeping busy, Mercer, he said. And then he turned and rode out with his two men behind him, and the sound of their horses faded down the road and was replaced by the wind. Marin stood in the doorway for a long moment after they were gone. Then she looked at Eli and said, Go find your sister, in a voice that was steady and ordinary. And Eli went, and she came down off the porch and stood in the yard and looked at the document in her hand. You know him, she said, not accusing, just placing the fact. Ran into him twice at trading posts over the years, Boone said. Boone. He was trying to buy out a family up near the Kettle River Basin 2 seasons back. Small outfit, older couple, their son ran it. They were behind on their note. What happened to them? Boone was quiet for a moment. They left in January, he said. Marin folded the document along its existing creases, carefully, the way you fold something you intend to look at again, even if you don't want to. $412, she said. I heard. I have 43, maybe 45 if I sell the draft horse. She looked up at him. I'm not telling you this because I expect you to do something about it. I'm telling you because you're here and you saw that, and I don't. She stopped, pressed her mouth flat for a moment. I don't have anyone else to say it to. Boone looked at her, at the document in her hand and the way she was holding herself, the particular uprightness of a person who has decided that whatever happens, they will not be seen coming apart in their own front yard. 11 weeks, he said. 11 weeks. He picked up the axe from where he'd set it against the fence post. Then we've got work to do, he said, and went back to splitting wood. He heard her exhale behind him, a long, ragged breath, and then her footsteps going back up the porch steps and into the house. It wasn't a solution. He knew that. 11 weeks of work on a ranch didn't produce $412, but the alternative was standing in a yard watching a woman fold a document that meant the end of everything she had left, and Boone Mercer had never in his life been able to find anything useful to do with standing still. The days that followed had their own rhythm, and Boone settled into it the way he settled into camp on a long trail. Not comfortably exactly, but functionally, the way a body learns the shape of new ground, while part of the mind stays watchful. He started teaching Eli things, not in a formal way, not with any announcement about it. Just the way it happens when a man is working and a 6-year-old is orbiting him constantly with the particular gravitational pull of a child who has decided someone is interesting. Boone showed him how to carry the smaller pieces of split wood without dropping them, stacked against the chest, not dragged. How to read the sky in the morning for what the afternoon was going to do. How to tell the difference between a track left that morning and one left the day before by looking at the edges and whether frost had formed inside the depression. Eli was a serious student. He didn't chatter while he was learning, which surprised Boone. He'd had the impression that 6-year-olds were constitutionally incapable of silence. But when Eli was watching something being demonstrated, he went quiet and still with a focus that seemed too old for his face. "My dad used to know stuff like that," Eli said one afternoon, watching Boone read a set of deer tracks along the creek bank. "About the woods." "What do you remember about him?" Boone asked. Eli considered the tracks. "He smelled like sawdust," he said finally. "And he could whistle 2 different ways, one regular and one through his teeth." He paused. "I keep trying to learn the teeth one, but I just spit." Boone almost smiled. "That one takes a while," he said. "Can you do it?" Boone demonstrated. Eli's eyes went wide. "Teach me," he said immediately. So Boone spent the better part of the walk back to the ranch teaching a 6-year-old to whistle through his teeth, and they arrived at the yard gate with Eli red-faced from blowing and producing nothing but air, furious and determined. And Clara was sitting on the porch fence watching them, and she said, "What's wrong with your face?" And Eli said, "I'm learning to whistle through my teeth." And Clara said, "You look like you're trying to sneeze sideways." And somehow that was the first time Boone heard Marin laugh. He was looking the other direction when it happened. He didn't turn around, but he heard it. Brief, unguarded, the kind of laugh that escapes before a person remembers they were saving themselves. He kept walking toward the barn and didn't say anything about it, but he carried the sound of it around for the rest of the afternoon in a way that troubled him slightly. The second visit from Voss's men came on a Thursday. Not Voss himself this time. One of the men he'd had with him, and a second one Boone hadn't seen before, older and dressed in town clothes rather than range gear. They came while Boone was on the far side of the property repairing the gate on the south pasture, and by the time he heard the horses and got back to the yard, the town-dressed man was standing on the porch talking to Marin through the door, which she had not opened all the way. Boone crossed the yard without rushing. The rider who'd stayed mounted watched him come with the specific blank expression of a man who's been told not to start anything. "What's this?" Boone said. Not to the rider. To the man on the porch. The town-dressed man turned. He had the careful neutrality of someone who works with paperwork and prefers it to people. "I'm here on behalf of Mr. Voss and the Hadley County Bank. I have some documents requiring Mrs. Calloway's signature." "What documents?" Boone said. "They relate to the outstanding debt in the terms of—" "She doesn't sign anything without a lawyer reviewing it first," Boone said. The man blinked. "Mr. Mercer, I don't believe that's— Is there a lawyer in Hadley?" A pause. "There is, but then she'll review the documents with him before she signs." Boone looked at the man steadily. "You can leave copies." The man looked at him, then passed him at Marin, who was watching from the doorway. She nodded once, and something in her expression said she hadn't known she could do this, that she'd been so used to Voss's machinery rolling toward her that it hadn't occurred to her that a person could simply stop it in place and say, "Wait." The man from town left copies. They rode out, and Marin came down off the porch and took the papers, and this time she looked at them properly, page by page, in the thin November light. "It's a pre-foreclosure agreement," she said. "He's trying to get me to sign over partial interest in the land, as collateral." "I know what it is," Boone said. She looked at him. "You've seen these before." "The Kettle River family signed one," he said. 2 months later, Voss used it to push the full foreclosure through. Once you sign partial interest over, the bank can call the whole note due on 60 days' notice instead of the original terms. Marin stood in the yard with the papers in her hand and said nothing for a long moment. The wind moved through the cottonwood, and somewhere in the upper branches a crow made a sound like something being torn. "He's not going to stop," she said. "No," Boone said. "He's not." "Then what do I do?" Boone looked at the fence line he'd repaired, the windmill turning on its refurbished break, the barn with its straightened roof pitch. He looked at the cows in the south pasture, the ones that were giving more milk now that they had proper feed and weren't standing in wet stalls. He looked at all of it, And then he looked at Marin. "You keep the ranch running," he said, "as well and as visibly as you can. You don't give him anything to point at and call failure." "That buys time," she said. "It doesn't buy $400. I know." "Boone," she said it flat, honest, "I need you to be straight with me. Do you see a way through this?" He was quiet for a moment that was longer than comfortable. "Not yet," he said, "but not yet isn't the same as no." She accepted that. He wasn't sure she believed it, but she accepted it, which took a different kind of courage. That night after the children were in bed, she put the papers on the kitchen table and sat across from him, and they went through every line together. She read slowly, her finger moving under the text, stopping when she hit language she didn't fully parse, and reading it again. Boone had never had much formal schooling, but he'd read enough contracts in his years of trading and trapping to know where the teeth were hidden in legal language, and he pointed them out one by one, and she listened. At some point she got up and came back with 2 cups of coffee. Real coffee, the good kind, which meant she'd been saving it, and set one in front of him without saying anything. They sat there for another hour. The fire burned down to coals. The wind outside had the sound of winter in it now, not just cold, but something heavier, the specific pressure of a season that's fully committed. "My father built a ranch," she said, not looking up from the papers. "Lost it to a man very much like Voss. I watched him sign papers at a kitchen table while 2 men stood behind him. I was 9. She turned a page. "I told myself I would never do that, never let someone stand behind me while I signed away something my family built." She was quiet. "Daniel knew that about me. He never pushed me to sell, even in the bad years. He understood that the land wasn't just land." Boone looked at his coffee. "My wife's family had a place," he said. He didn't say it to trade stories. He said it because she'd offered him something, and it seemed right to offer something back. "Small farm, up north. She grew up there. When she died..." He stopped, steadied. "It went back to her family, her parents. That was right. It was their place, really. But it meant..." He paused again. "My kids grew up in a place that I had no claim to, which meant when her father passed and the family sold, my children were just visiting a house that got sold out from under them." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "That's why I've been out here, working, trying to get enough together to buy them something that's actually ours." Marin looked up at him from across the table. He hadn't said that to anyone. He'd been carrying it for 2 years through mountain passes and trading posts and long, cold weeks of setting traps alone, and the fact that it had come out now, at this kitchen table, said something about this place and this woman and this hour that he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "How close are you?" she asked. He thought about the pelts. He had them cached. He always traveled with his best inventory, didn't trust leaving it anywhere. And what he had, properly sold at a trading post or directly to a buyer who knew quality, was worth. He did the math the way he always did it, the way you learn to do math when every number is connected to something you can't afford to lose. "Close enough to matter," he said. "Not close enough yet." She nodded. She didn't ask him to be more specific, and he was grateful for that. They sat in silence for a while, and it was the particular kind of silence that isn't empty, the kind that has things in it that both people can hear without them being said. "Why are you still here, Boone?" she asked finally. Her voice was quiet and direct, the way her voice got when she was asking the real question. "The fence is fixed, the windmill's running, the barn roof will hold through winter. You've done more than anyone could have asked for. Why haven't you moved on?" He looked at his coffee, the coals in the stove, the papers on the table. "Because Voss is going to come back," he said. "And because..." He stopped, started again. "Because your boy spent 3 days practicing whistling through his teeth, and this afternoon he finally did it, just for a second, out by the water trough. And he looked at me like I'd given him something important." He set the cup down. "I wasn't ready to leave before he knows he can do it every time." Marin looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back down at the papers. "The lawyer in Hadley?" she said. "His name is Aldous Fitch. He's not particularly good, but he's honest, which out here is worth more than good. We should go see him," Boone said, "before the next Monday visit." "We," she said. "If that's all right." She gathered the papers into a careful stack and set them to one side of the table, out of the way, but within reach. "Tuesday," she said. "We'll go Tuesday." He nodded. She picked up her coffee and they sat for a while longer without talking, and outside the wind worked at the corners of the house. And the house, Daniel's house, the house built by 14 years of one man's hands, held against it the way it had been built to do, and for that particular hour, in that particular light, it was enough. Boone rode into Hadley the next morning alone, before Marin was up. He told himself it was to check on supply prices and see what the trading post had for winter stock, which was true. He also rode past the bank, which was a 2-story brick building with the name Hadley County Bank and Trust pressed into the stone above the door in letters that had been placed there to suggest permanence and authority. He sat on his horse outside it for a while. Then he rode to the trading post and spent an hour with the man behind the counter, discussing pelt prices with the specific and unhurried carefulness of a man who knows exactly what he has and is not in any hurry to undervalue it. When he rode back to the ranch that afternoon, he came through the gate and found Clara sitting on the top rail of the repaired fence, looking down the road with an expression that was trying very hard to be something other than worried. "Mama thought you'd left," Clara said. The way she said it was too careful to be casual. Boone dismounted and led his horse through the gate. "I told her I was going into town." "She didn't tell us that part." Clara climbed down from the fence rail. "Eli cried, but he said he didn't." Boone led the horse toward the barn. Clara walked alongside him, hands in her coat pockets. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Not yet." "Not yet," she repeated. She'd picked up on the qualifier immediately, the way sharp children do with the words adults choose. "But sometime." He stopped outside the barn door and looked at her, 8 years old, with her mother's directness and her father's. He didn't know what was her father's, but something in the way she stood her ground suggested it. "Yes," he said. "Sometime. I have my own kids, Clara. They're waiting on me." She processed this. "What are their names?" "Thomas. He's 9. And Rosie. She's 7. "Older than Eli," Clara said. "Close to me." She looked at the horse, then at Boone. "Do they know you're here? Helping us?" "They know I'm working," he said. "Same as always." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Do they miss you?" The question landed the way only questions from children can land, with no weight intended and all of it hitting anyway. "I expect they do," Boone said. Clara looked at him, then she nodded, once with a gravity that belonged on someone much older. "Then you should make sure this is worth it," she said. "Whatever you're doing here, make sure it's worth the missing." She went back to the house and left him standing at the barn door, with his horse's reins in his hand and a 9-year-old girl's words working their way through him like a splinter that's gone too deep to ignore. He unsaddled the horse in silence, working by feel in the dim barn, and he thought about Thomas and Rosie and the last time he'd seen them, which had been in April, standing outside their grandmother's house in the thin spring light. Thomas, with his arms crossed and his jaw set in that way he had, trying not to show anything. Rosie holding a rag doll and watching him ride out with eyes that asked a question he hadn't been able to answer. He'd been telling himself he was getting close, that what he was building, pelt by pelt, season by season, would be enough soon, and soon he'd go back and bring them home, and they'd have something real and permanent. He'd told himself that story so many times it had developed the smooth, worn quality of something handled every day. But Clara was right, and Clara was 8, and Thomas was 9, and Rosie was 7, and they were waiting on him in a house that wasn't theirs either, with a grandmother who was good to them but tired, and soon wasn't the same thing as now. He needed to finish this. Whatever this was, whatever it was turning into, here on this ranch that wasn't his, with this family that wasn't his, he needed to see it through and then do what he'd come out here to do. He would fix what he could fix. He would go with Marin to see Aldous Fitch on Tuesday and find out what the law could do about Voss's papers and Voss's men and Voss's very particular method of taking things from people who couldn't fight back. And then he would figure out what came after. He hung the saddle on its rack and smoothed his hand down the horse's flank, and the horse shifted and exhaled and settled. And outside the barn, the wind had died down to almost nothing, and for a moment the property was utterly quiet. No crows, no cattle, no children, just the particular silence of a place that had been close to dying and had been, by some accumulation of unlikely events, pulled back from the edge. It wasn't safe yet, not by a long measure. Gideon Voss didn't give up on things he'd decided were his, and a man like that, with a banker in his pocket and riders at his disposal, was not finished just because a trapper had shown up and fixed a fence. Boone knew that. He stood in the quiet barn, and he knew it completely, and the knowing settled into him the way it always did. Not as fear, which he'd mostly wrung out of himself over years of sleeping in places where fear was expensive, but as a specific and useful attention. The kind that keeps a man sharp when things start to move. He walked out of the barn and latched the door behind him. The kitchen window was lit. Through it, he could see Marin at the stove and Eli on the floor with something he was building out of sticks, and Clara at the table with her slate board. The ordinary shapes of an ordinary evening. He stood in the dark yard and looked at it for a moment. Then he went inside. Aldous Fitch occupied a small office above the feed store on Hadley's main street, accessible by an exterior staircase that creaked so badly on the way up that Boone was fairly certain it served as the lawyer's early warning system against unwanted visitors. The office itself smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and the particular staleness of a room where a man spends too much time alone with difficult problems. Fitch himself was somewhere past 60, with a fringe of white hair around a bald head spotted with age, and the permanently tired expression of a man who has spent decades watching people make decisions they couldn't afford. He read through Voss's pre-foreclosure agreement with the slow, line-by-line attention of someone who'd learned not to trust speed, and when he was done, he set the papers on his desk and folded his hands on top of them. "It's legal," he said. "I know it's legal," Marin said. "I want to know if it's beatable." Fitch looked at her over the top of his glasses. Then he looked at Boone, sitting in the chair beside her with his hat on his knee. "The language in Section 4, he said, tapping the document without opening it, gives the bank the right to accelerate the full note upon transfer of any partial interest in the property, which means the moment you sign this, Voss can go to the bank, which he already controls, let's be honest about that, and call the entire $412 due within 60 days, regardless of your original January 15 date. So he's shortening the window," Boone said. "He's eliminating it," Fitch said. January 15th is your legal deadline under the original note. That's the date that matters. As long as you don't sign anything new, that date holds. Voss can't touch it without your signature." Marin sat with her hands flat on her thighs, looking at the document. "Then I don't sign." "Then you don't sign," Fitch agreed. "But you need to understand what that means. It means Voss has to wait until January 15th, and it means he will spend the weeks between now and then making your life as difficult as he legally can, possibly in ways that approach the edge of legal without crossing it." He paused. "He's done it before." "The Kettle River family," Boone said. Fitch looked at him sharply. "You know about that." "Enough." The lawyer sat back in his chair, and it made a sound that suggested it had heard this kind of conversation before and was tired of it. "What are your options for payment, realistically?" Marin told him what she'd told Boone. $43, maybe $45. The draft horse possibly bringing another $20 if she sold it, which she didn't want to do because without the horse the spring plowing didn't happen, and without the spring plowing the property started dying again in a different way. Fitch listened without interrupting. "You need $350 in 11 weeks, he said when she finished, give or take. On a frontier ranch in the middle of winter." "Yes." Fitch was quiet for a moment. "Is there anyone who might lend—" "No," Marin said, simply, not bitterly. Just the truth of a woman who'd already looked at every door and found them closed. The lawyer looked at Boone. "And you? You're a trapper, Mr. Mercer. What are your pelts worth?" It was a direct question, and Boone hadn't expected it. He was quiet for a moment, doing the math again the way he'd been doing it since that morning in the barn. The numbers he'd been carrying for 2 years laid out against a number he hadn't been carrying until 2 weeks ago. "Enough to matter," he said. "Not enough for all of it." "How much is enough to matter?" Boone told him. Fitch wrote it down on a piece of paper, added Marin's $43, and looked at the sum. That's still short, he said. I know. By about $90. I know that too. Fitch looked at them both for a moment, and then he did something Boone hadn't expected from a man with that permanently tired face. He opened his desk drawer and took out a piece of paper that was different from the legal documents. Smaller, personal, with handwriting on it that was not the careful penmanship of a professional. He looked at it for a moment and then set it face down on the desk. I can't lend money, he said. It's not ethical in my position, and I don't have enough to make a difference anyway. But there are people in this county who have reasons to want Gideon Voss to lose something. People who've watched him work for years and haven't had an opportunity to push back. He tapped the upside-down paper with one finger. I can make some quiet inquiries. I cannot promise anything, and I will not promise anything, but I want you to know I'm going to try. Marin looked at the paper without touching it. Why? She said. Fitch picked up his pen and set it down again, a small gesture of a man choosing his words. Because the Kettle River family had a daughter my wife taught to read, he said, and they left in January without saying goodbye, because that's what happens when a person is ashamed. And my wife cried about it for a week. He straightened his papers on his desk. That's why. They rode back to the ranch mostly in silence. The sky had turned the heavy gray of a sky that's decided something, and the temperature was dropping with intent. Boone could feel it through his coat. Not just cold, but the wet, insistent cold that moves into your joints and stays. Do you think he'll find anything? Marin asked after a while. The road was empty in both directions, the grass on either side brown and pressed flat by the wind. I think he'll try, Boone said. Whether he finds it is a different thing. $90, she said, looking ahead. $90 is the difference between keeping my land and losing it. $90 is still not $400. But Fitch might account for 30 or 40, and I could... She stopped. He could see her doing arithmetic the way she probably did it in the night when she couldn't sleep, moving numbers around trying to find a configuration that worked. If I sell the draft horse, and I take on the Halverson washing, which I've been refusing to do because it's 2 days a week I don't have, but if I take it, Marin, I'm trying to find a way. I know you are. He looked at her profile, the set of her jaw. So am I. She looked at him. Something in his expression must have said more than his words, because she held the look for a moment. Don't do something foolish, she said. I'm not planning to. You have that face right now. That face men get when they're about to do something they think is noble and haven't thought through completely. I don't have a face, he said. You have a very specific face, she said, and looked back at the road. He didn't say anything else about it. But when they got back to the ranch and he went to the barn to unsaddle the horses, he stayed a while afterward in the dim interior, crouched down beside the canvas bundle he kept stashed beneath the floorboards of the tack room. The one place on the property that locked. The padlock on the door, something he'd asked Marin's permission about on his third day, explaining only that he had valuables he preferred to keep secured. He unwrapped one corner of the bundle and looked at the pelts inside. Silver fox. Beaver, the best grades, thick and winter prime. 3 mountain lion skins that had taken him most of one season to accumulate. Marten. A single wolf pelt, black, which was worth more than everything else in the bundle combined if he found the right buyer. He'd been promised a buyer in Cheyenne who dealt directly with Eastern markets. A man who'd looked at samples Boone had brought to a trading post in the spring and offered him a price that had made Boone count the months until he'd have enough. Made him do the math on a piece of bark with a charred stick because he didn't have paper and he needed to see the number in front of him to believe it. He rewrapped the bundle and replaced the floorboards. He didn't make any decisions that afternoon, but he thought about what Clara had said. Make sure it's worth the missing. And he thought about Thomas with his arms crossed in the spring light and Rosie with her rag doll. And he thought about Marin with a legal document in her hand and the knowledge that $90 stood between her children and the loss of the only home they remembered. He didn't decide anything. But the thinking had a weight to it that was different from before. Voss moved faster than any of them had expected. On the following Monday, 3 weeks and 2 days before Christmas, his man didn't come with papers. He came with two other men and a wagon, and they pulled up to the gate in the early afternoon while Boone was on the far pasture checking the cattle water situation, a trough that had developed a slow leak, and Marin was alone in the yard splitting kindling. By the time Boone got back, the man with the papers was reading something aloud from a document, while Marin stood in the yard with the hatchet still in her hand and her face doing the thing it did when she was holding herself in with both hands. The two other men were on the wagon, not threatening, not armed and visible, just present, just wait. Boone came through the gate at a walk that was faster than a walk without being a run. "What is this?" he said. The man with the papers, the same town-dressed one from before, turned with an expression of neutral efficiency. "The bank has identified a procedural irregularity in the original note. The property assessment was conducted under the previous county recorder, who has since been found to have improperly recorded 3 separate land transactions. The bank is within its rights to request a new assessment." "And in the meantime," Boone said, "in the meantime, the bank has placed a provisional lien on certain assets, pending the outcome of the review." He looked at the wagon. "That includes the 2 milk cows." Marin made a sound. Not loud, just a single exhaled syllable, like someone hit. "You cannot do that," she said. Her voice was steady in the way that a bowstring is steady, under tension that's close to its limit. "The bank has the right to secure assets against the outstanding debt, Mrs. Calloway. The cows are listed in the original property inventory. Those cows are how I feed my children," she said. "That milk is... We don't have..." She stopped. She pressed her mouth shut and didn't finish because finishing meant saying in front of these men what her situation actually was, and she would not do that. Boone stepped in front of the man with the papers. Not aggressively, just placement, the act of a body existing in a specific space between one person and another. "This assessment review," he said quietly. "Who's conducting it?" "The bank has appointed..." "Who?" Boone said. The man paused. "Mr. Voss has been authorized to oversee..." "The man who wants to buy the land is conducting the assessment of the land." Boone said it flat. "That's what you're telling me." "I'm telling you what the bank has..." "Is Aldous Fitch aware of this?" Boone said. The town-dressed man's neutral efficiency flickered. Just slightly, just enough. "I don't see what Mr. Fitch has to do with..." "He has everything to do with it," Boone said, "because he's been retained to review the legal standing of the original note and any subsequent bank actions related to this property." He hadn't been told by Fitch to say this. He wasn't entirely certain it was accurate, but it was close enough to the truth of the conversation they'd had in that office, and the look on the man's face told him it had landed. "I'd recommend," Boone said, "that you take that wagon back to wherever it came from and let Mr. Fitch and the bank's lawyers discuss the procedural irregularity before anyone takes any assets off this property. Because if that assessment is improper, and I have a feeling that Aldous Fitch is going to find it very interesting, then removing those cows would constitute illegal seizure, and that's a different kind of document than the ones you've been bringing out here." The man with the papers looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Marin. Then he rolled the document he'd been reading from and tucked it under his arm with the careful motion of a man who has decided that discretion is the better part of his current position. "The bank will be in touch," he said. "I expect it will," Boone said. They left. The wagon rolled back through the gate with its 2 men and its empty bed, and Marin stood in the yard with the hatchet hanging at her side, watching them go until the sound of the wagon faded down the road. Then she crouched down in the dirt of the yard, just sat down on her heels, and put her free hand over her eyes. Boone stood near her. He didn't touch her. He waited. After a moment, she lowered her hand. Her eyes were dry. She'd been fighting too long to have tears for this particular thing, or maybe she was saving them for something worse. She looked at the road where the wagon had gone. "He's escalating," she said. "Yes." "He's going to keep escalating." "Yes." She stood back up, brushed the dirt from her knee with one hand, automatic. "The milk cows. If he takes those..." She stopped. "Clara and Eli have had milk every morning since you fixed the barn." "Every morning. That's not..." She stopped again, pressed her palm flat against the side of her leg. "I know it sounds small." "It doesn't sound small," Boone said. She looked at him. The afternoon light was low and gray, and it caught the angles of her face in a way that showed the tiredness there. The specific, accumulated tiredness of someone who has been strong for a very long time with very little to be strong on. "What did you actually tell Fitch?" she asked. "About being retained." "I told him we'd spoken with you and were reviewing options," Boone said. "Which is true. That's not the same as being retained." "No," he said. "It's not." She almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to her face, but it came close, and in the gray afternoon light, close was something. "You were bluffing," she said. "I was buying time," he said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "About 2 weeks' worth," he said, "which is what we needed." She looked at the barn. The cows were visible through the open lower door, shifting and warm, unbothered by the afternoon's events in the way cattle have of being entirely unbothered by human catastrophe. "I'm going to write to Fitch today," she said. "Formally. Retain him properly. I have enough for his initial fee if I use what I was saving for December's supply run." "That's a good idea." "Don't tell me it's a good idea like you're surprised," she said. "I'm not surprised," he said. "I'm agreeing." "You're agreeing with a tone." "I don't have a tone." She looked at him with something that was tired and sharp and almost amused all at once. "You have tones, Boone. You have faces and you have tones. You should know this about yourself." She went inside to write the letter, and he went to check on the cows and then to finish with the water trough. And while he worked in the fading afternoon, he thought about 2 weeks, and what could be done in 2 weeks, and whether 2 weeks was enough. The answer kept coming up as probably not, but probably not had gotten him further than he'd expected before. Clara found out something was wrong in the way children find things out. Not from being told, but from the specific quality of adult silence and the way the air in the house had changed. She didn't ask directly. What she did was appear at Boone's elbow the next morning while he was mending harness leather at the workbench in the barn, and she sat on a nail keg and watched him for a while without saying anything. Then she said, "Is Mr. Voss going to take our house?" Boone kept his attention on the leather. "Where'd you hear that name?" "I've heard it lots of times," she said. "Mama says it when she thinks we're asleep. And now you say it in that way." "What way?" "Quiet," she said. "The way people say something when they're angry at it." He trimmed the leather with his knife and overlapped the ends. "Nobody's taking your house," he said. Clara was quiet for a moment. "You don't know that for sure." He looked at her. "No," he said. "I don't." She seemed to appreciate the honesty more than a reassurance would have given her. She straightened on the nail keg and looked at the harness. "My dad used to say that the only thing you can do when someone's trying to take something from you is make sure they have to work very hard to do it," she said. "He said that made it cost them something too." Boone set the harness down. "Your dad was right about that." "I know," she said, with the absolute certainty of a child who has decided their dead parent was right about most things and does not intend to be argued out of it. "So we're going to make it cost him." "That's the idea," Boone said. She slid off the nail keg. "Okay," she said, as if something had been settled. "Eli's trying to whistle again. He can almost do it half the time now." "I heard him," Boone said, "yesterday by the water pump. He practices when he thinks nobody's listening." She paused at the barn door. "He misses you when you're in the barn." Boone picked up the harness again. "Tell him I'll be in for supper." Clara disappeared, and he sat with the leather and the smell of the barn and the low sound of cattle, and thought about a 6-year-old practicing a whistle in secret, and a dead man who'd said the right thing to his daughter, and a woman writing a letter at her kitchen table with the last of her December money. He thought about Thomas, about whether Thomas was practicing anything in secret, whether there was someone in his grandmother's house who'd shown him something worth practicing. He thought about Voss, who would be back, who was constructing something piece by piece with the patience of a man who has never had to be in a hurry because he has always had the resources to simply wait and the money to make time move the way he wanted it to. Voss was going to come back with more papers, more riders, more procedural irregularities, more provisional liens, more of the slow-grinding machinery that turned good people's lives into transactions. He was going to come back, and he was going to keep coming until something stopped him, or there was nothing left to come back for. Boone finished the harness and hung it on its hook and stood for a moment in the center of the barn. The bundled pelts were under the floorboards of the tack room behind him. He could feel them there the way you feel something you've been thinking about, a specific awareness, like a pressure. He thought about what they were worth. He thought about what they were for. He thought about the gap between those two things and what it would take to close it. He went to the tack room. He opened the padlock. He lifted the floorboards and unwrapped the bundle and laid each pelt out on the workbench with care, the way you handle things that have cost you something real, and he looked at them for a long time. The black wolf, the 3 mountain lion, the silver fox and the prime beaver, the marten bundle. All of it representing 2 years of seasons he wouldn't get back, territory he'd covered alone, camps he'd made in weather that would have kept most men indoors. 2 years of his children growing up in a house that wasn't his while he was out here in the dark, making something that was supposed to change that. He sat down on the floor of the tack room with his back against the wall and his arms on his knees, and he looked at the pelts on the workbench, and he thought about what Clara had said on the porch fence. Make sure it's worth the missing. He was still sitting there when he heard the sound of a horse coming fast up the road. Not the organized sound of Voss's men, but a single horse, hard-ridden, the kind of speed that means something has happened. He was on his feet and through the barn door before he'd finished the thought, and he saw Marin already at the gate, and the rider was young, barely 20, a boy from one of the neighboring spreads by the look of him, and he was pulling his horse up short and saying something to Marin in a voice too low to carry, and Marin's hand went to her mouth. Boone crossed the yard. "What happened?" he said. The boy looked at him with the wide eyes of someone who has ridden hard with bad news and is only now arriving at the weight of delivering it. "Mister, Voss was at the county recorder's office this morning," the boy said. "My uncle works there. He came to tell us. Voss filed an emergency petition with the circuit judge." He swallowed. "For a hearing, December 22nd. Marin lowered her hand. Her face had gone the particular stillness of someone doing fast, terrible math. "That's 3 weeks away," Boone said. "Yes, sir," the boy said. "And the January 15 date. If the judge rules on the petition, the January 15 date doesn't matter anymore." It was Marin who said it. Her voice was quiet and absolutely steady, which was worse somehow than if it had shaken. "A circuit judge's ruling supersedes the original note terms." She looked at Boone. "He found a way to move the clock." The boy's horse shifted and stamped, still warm from the ride. "My uncle said Mr. Voss was in a good mood when he left," the boy said, as if this additional detail was necessary to complete the picture. "Said he was smiling." Boone looked at Marin. 3 weeks. 3 weeks instead of 11, and a judge who operated out of the county seat where Gideon Voss had been doing business for years, buying influence the way he bought land, steadily, patiently, with the quiet confidence of a man who considers it an investment. Marin looked back at him. Something passed between them in that look. Not words, not yet, but the acknowledgement of a new and very specific kind of crisis, and the question underneath it that neither of them had said aloud yet. "What are you willing to do?" She looked away first, back at the boy. "Thank you," she said. "Tell your uncle thank you." The boy nodded and turned his horse and rode back down the road, and the sound of his hooves faded and the wind came up from the north again, and Marin stood at her gate with her hands at her sides, looking at nothing in particular. 3 weeks, she said. "I heard," Boone said. Eli's voice came from the house, calling for his mother, something about supper, the ordinary voice of a child who did not know yet what 3 weeks meant or didn't mean. Marin turned toward the house. She stopped. "I won't let them have it," she said. Not to Boone specifically, not to anyone specifically, just out loud, into the cold afternoon, a statement made to the air and the fences and the windmill and the barn that her husband had built. Then she went inside to answer her son. Boone stood at the gate for a while after she'd gone in. The sky above the mountains had turned the deep charcoal of an early winter dark, and the first stars were coming out over the ridge, sharp and cold and indifferent to the particular problem of one family, on one piece of land in one corner of the frontier. He went back to the tack room. He looked at the pelts for a long time. Then he began, carefully and without haste, to count them. He counted them twice, then a third time. Because the number kept meaning the same thing, and he kept hoping it would mean something different. It didn't. The pelts laid out on the workbench in the lamplight of the tack room told him exactly what he already knew. At the price the Cheyenne buyer had quoted him in the spring. A fair price. A good price. The price that had kept him out here for 2 more seasons when part of him had wanted to quit. The full bundle was worth somewhere between $480 and $520, depending on condition and the Eastern market on whatever day the transaction happened. $412 was what Marin owed. He stood at the workbench for a long time looking at that arithmetic, as when he'd ridden away in April. It was the thing he'd been building toward through 2 winters and 100 cold mornings, when the only reason to get up was because the traps needed checking and the work needed doing and the number had to keep growing. He wrapped the pelts back up, replaced the floorboards, hung the padlock. He stood outside the tack room in the dark barn and listened to the cows moving and the wind outside working at the eaves, and he didn't make any decisions. He told himself he hadn't made any decisions. He went to the house for supper and sat at the table and ate the stew Marin had made, real stew, with root vegetables and a bone she'd had soaking since morning, and listened to Eli talk about how he'd seen a hawk take a rabbit in the south field that afternoon, and the whole thing had happened so fast, it was almost like the rabbit had never existed at all. "Where do you think it went?" Eli asked. Meaning the rabbit. "Hawks gotta eat," Boone said. Eli considered this with the philosophical seriousness of a 6-year-old confronting the food chain. "But the rabbit didn't do anything wrong." "No," Boone said. "It didn't. That's not fair." "Most things aren't," Clara said from behind her bowl, with the world-weary authority of someone twice her age and half her actual years. Marin looked at her daughter and then at Boone, and something in her expression said she'd heard that and it had landed somewhere complicated. She stood up to take the pot back to the stove, and Boone watched her move through the kitchen with the particular efficiency of a woman who has never had the luxury of being inefficient, who has learned to make every motion count because there was never enough time or energy to spend carelessly. He looked away before she turned back around. After the children were in bed, Marin sat at the table with Fitch's copy of the original note and a piece of paper where she'd been doing her own arithmetic. The stove had burned down to the reliable low heat of a well-tended fire. Outside, the wind had stilled for once, and the night was very quiet. "Fitch sent word back today," she said. She hadn't mentioned it until now. "About the circuit judge." "And?" "Judge Harlan Price. He's been on the circuit for 11 years. She looked at the note without reading it. "Fitch says he's not corrupt. He's also not sympathetic to debtors. He's the kind of judge who believes that a contract is a contract and a debt is a debt, and extenuating circumstances are what you call it when you want someone to feel sorry for you." "Voss knew that when he filed with him," Boone said. "Yes." She set the paper down. "Fitch also says that our best argument before Price is procedural, that Voss's petition doesn't meet the legal standard for emergency review under territorial law, and that the bank's provisional lien on the cows was improper because the assessment review was conducted by an interested party." She paused. "He says maybe 40% chance Price dismisses the petition on those grounds." 40%, Boone said. 40%, she repeated, which leaves 60% where the hearing goes forward and Price rules on the debt itself. She looked at him directly. "And if it goes to the debt, I lose. There's no argument for the debt. The debt is real." Boone was quiet. "I need to ask you something," Marin said. Her voice had the quality it got when she was asking the real question, the direct, undecorated version without softening around the edges. "And I need you to answer me honestly." "All right," he said. "The pelts." She said it plainly. She'd known about them from the beginning. He'd told her they were there, had asked to secure the tack room, and she wasn't a stupid woman. She'd been doing her own arithmetic longer than he'd known her. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I want to make that clear before I say the rest of it. I am not asking." "Marin, let me finish." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "I know what those pelts mean. I know what they're for. I know about Thomas and Rosie, not all of it, but enough. You've told me enough that I understand what 2 years of work means when you've got children waiting on the other end of it." She paused. And I am not asking you to give that up for my land. I want that to be absolutely clear between us." "It's clear," he said. "But I need to know," she said, "because I've been lying awake figuring the angles, and every angle I run comes back to the same number, and that number is what's in that tack room." She held his eyes. "So I need to know what you're thinking, not what you're deciding, what you're thinking." The fire made a small sound, something settling. Boone looked at his hands on the table. Large, scarred, the hands of a man who's spent 20 years doing work that shows. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that the number works. That if I sold the full bundle, it would cover your debt and leave a little over." He paused. "And I'm thinking about what it would mean to do that." "What would it mean?" she said quietly. "It would mean I go back to the mountain next season," he said. "Start over. 2 more years, maybe 3, to build back to where I am." He looked up at her. "And Thomas and Rosie wait longer, in a house that isn't mine and isn't theirs." Maren sat with that for a moment. She didn't look away from him. "Then don't do it," she said. "That's my answer. Don't do it. You'd lose the ranch." "I know what I'd lose," she said. "I've known what I was going to lose since September. I was just trying to find a way around it." She folded the paper in front of her carefully, along lines that were already there from the last time she'd folded it. "Your children have been waiting long enough." "Maren, don't." She stood up and took her coffee cup to the basin and stood there with her back to him for a moment. "Don't make this into something I said generously. I'm not being generous. I'm being honest." She turned around. "It would not be right. Taking what you've built away from your family to save mine. That's not a trade I'm willing to be responsible for. Not for any piece of land." Boone stood up from the table. "I've been thinking about it for 3 days," he said, "since the boy came with the news about the petition. I've been in that tack room looking at those pelts every night after you're all asleep, and I keep running the same numbers, and they keep coming out the same way." He stopped, steadied. "And I keep thinking about what it would mean to stand here with what I have and watch you lose this place because the number was right there and I didn't use it. Boone, I keep thinking about Eli learning to whistle," he said, "and I keep thinking about Clara on that fence rail telling me to make it worth the missing." His voice had gone quieter. "And I keep thinking about Daniel Calloway building this place with his hands for 14 years, and what it means that his kids might grow up somewhere else because one man with enough money decided he wanted the land." Maren was very still. "And I keep trying to talk myself out of it," he said. "I keep putting Thomas and Rosie on one side and the arithmetic on the other and telling myself that's the answer, that I owe my children the years I've already taken from them and I can't take any more." He looked at her. "And then I think about you at that table folding that piece of paper." The silence between them had a texture to it. "I can't ask you to do this," she said. Her voice had changed. Something in it had come loose from the careful steadiness she kept it at. "You didn't ask," he said. "That's the thing. You specifically didn't ask." "Then I'm asking you not to," she said. "I'm asking you to take those pelts to Cheyenne and get your price and go get your kids." He looked at her for a long moment. "Let me think about it until morning," he said. She looked like she wanted to say more. Instead, she pressed her mouth flat and nodded, once, and went to bed. He sat at the table alone for a long time after that. He didn't think clearly. He'd already thought clearly, had run the thinking out to its end multiple times, and kept arriving at the same place. What he did was sit with it, with the weight of 2 different things, both real, both mattering completely, and no arrangement of them that felt anything other than costly. He fell asleep in the chair sometime past midnight and woke before dawn to the sound of Biscuit moving on the porch, and for a moment, the brief, unguarded moment before full consciousness, he didn't know where he was. Heard the fire, heard the wind come back up, and felt, in that moment of not knowing, something that he didn't have a name for exactly, something that felt like belonging, which was a feeling he hadn't had in a long time and hadn't expected to have here. He got up before anyone else was awake and went to the barn. He stood in the tack room for the last time with the bundle on the workbench and his hand flat on top of it. Then he made his decision, not because the arithmetic changed, not because he found an argument he hadn't considered before. He made it because he'd spent 20 years making choices based on what the numbers said, and the numbers had gotten him somewhere specific, alone in a tack room in the dark, touching a bundle of pelts that represented everything, while a family he'd come to care about more than was convenient slept in the house 20 yards away. And Thomas and Rosie were 9 and 7 and growing up without him regardless. And 2 more years or 3 more years of growing up without him. It wouldn't be fixed by this land deal, but it also wouldn't be broken by stopping it. What would be broken was something else, something he didn't have a clean word for. But he knew what it felt like to live with a thing you didn't do when you could have done it, and he was not interested in that particular weight. He wrapped the bundle back up and carried it to his horse. He was riding out of the yard before the sun was fully up when he heard the door. Boone! Marin was on the porch in her coat, her hair down, barefoot on the cold boards. She'd heard him saddling up. He stopped the horse. "I'm going into town," he said. "I'll be back by afternoon." She looked at him, at the bundle behind the saddle. She knew what it was. "Don't," she said. One word. "I'm not asking for permission," he said, not unkindly. "This is my decision to make. It's your children's future." "I know what it is," he said. "I've known what it is for 3 days." He looked at her across the yard in the gray early morning. "I'm going to get a fair price from Walt Devers at the trading post. He knows pelts and he's honest. And then I'm going to the bank." Marin stood on the porch with her arms at her sides, and she looked at him for a long moment that had everything in it. The argument she wasn't making, the gratitude she wasn't expressing because expressing it would mean accepting it, and underneath both of those, something raw that she didn't have words for either. "I'll pay you back," she said finally. "Every dollar. It'll take years, but I will." "I know you will," he said. That was never the question. He rode out through the gate. Walt Devers at the trading post was a heavy-set man with a gray beard and the careful eyes of someone who has been lied to about quality enough times to have developed a thorough system for not being lied to again. He untied the bundle on the trading post counter and went through the pelts one by one, with his hands and his nose and a small glass lens he kept on a leather cord around his neck. He didn't speak during this process. He made occasional sounds that communicated nothing except that he was still thinking. When he was done, he straightened up and looked at Boone. "Black Wolf's exceptional," he said. "Mountain Lion's good grade, all 3. Silver Fox I've seen better, but this is still quality." He set the lens down on the counter. "460, he said. "And that's me being fair, which I am, but I want you to know the range I'm working in." "I need 420, Boone said, "and I need it today." Devers looked at him. Something in the look was a question that wasn't about the pelts. "This about the Calloway place," he said. Boone looked at him. "Word gets around," Devers said, not apologetically, just factually. "Voss has been in here twice in the last month buying supplies for his riders. Man talks too much when he thinks he's winning." He paused. "That widow's got 2 kids." "She does," Boone said. Devers looked at the pelts again. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man doing arithmetic that isn't about money. 420, Devers said. "Exact. And you can tell Aldous Fitch that Walt Devers said hello." Boone didn't ask how Devers knew about Fitch. He just said thank you and meant it. He carried the money to the bank. The bank manager was a thin man named Corveal, who had the general demeanor of someone who worked for people he was slightly afraid of and compensated for this by being very precise about paperwork. When Boone laid $412 in certified notes on the counter and said he was paying the outstanding balance on the Calloway property note in full, Corveal looked at the money and then at Boone and then at the money again. "Mr. Voss has a pending petition," Corveal began. "The debt is being paid in full," Boone said. "Today, before any court date." He looked at Corveal steadily, which means the petition has nothing to act on. The note is satisfied. He paused. "You can confirm that with Mr. Fitch if you'd like. He's been retained specifically to review any bank actions related to this account." Corveal picked up one of the notes. Set it down. Picked up another. "I'll need to issue a receipt," Corveal said. "I'd appreciate that," Boone said. It took 40 minutes. Corveal was very thorough about his paperwork, which Boone had expected and didn't rush. He stood at the counter while the man wrote out the receipt in triplicate, one for the bank, one for Marin, one for Fitch, and when it was done and signed and stamped, Boone folded his copy and put it in his coat pocket and walked out of the bank into the cold December street. He stood outside for a moment. The money was gone. 2 years of seasons gone in 40 minutes of careful paperwork. He waited to feel something specific about that. Regret or loss or the particular hollow feeling of a sacrifice made. And what he felt instead was complicated and not what he'd expected. There was something in it that wasn't hollow at all. He rode back to the ranch. He was unsaddling his horse when he heard the wagon. He came out of the barn and saw Voss coming through the gate, and this time Voss wasn't riding. He was in a surrey, properly dressed, and there were 4 riders with him instead of 2, and a man in a dark coat who had the look of a banker about him, which made sense because he was almost certainly the man Corville had sent word to the moment Boone had walked out of the bank. Voss's face, when he pulled the surrey up, was the face of a man who has received information he doesn't like, and has come to verify it in person before deciding what to do about it. Marin was already at the door. She'd seen the riders coming, and she was standing on the porch with Clara and Eli behind her, Clara's hand on Eli's shoulder, both of them very still. Boone crossed the yard and stood near the porch, not on it, in the yard, between the surrey and the house. Voss looked at him, then at Marin. "I've been told," Voss said, "that someone came to the bank this morning and made a payment against this note." "That's right," Boone said. Voss's pale eyes moved to him. "In full." "In full," Boone said. "Note satisfied. You can verify that with Mr. Corville." He reached into his coat and took out the receipt. "Or you can read the receipt." Voss did not reach for the receipt. He looked at it from a distance, the way a man looks at something he already knows the contents of and doesn't want to give the satisfaction of engaging with. "Who paid it?" Voss said. "Doesn't matter who paid it," Boone said. "What matters is it's paid." Voss looked at him for a long moment. The riders behind the surrey were still, their horses' breath showing in the cold air. The banker in the dark coat was looking at his hands. "Where did a trapper get $400? Voss said. "That's not a question you have standing to ask," Boone said. Voss's jaw tightened. "Not much, yes." He was practiced at controlling his face, but enough. He looked past Boone at Marin on the porch. "This isn't finished," he said. His voice was flat and even, the voice of a man who has access to many different tools and is already moving through his inventory. "The note is satisfied," Boone said, "which means the petition has no basis, which means Fitch is going to be in front of Judge Price before the week is out asking for a dismissal." He paused. "And I expect he's going to get it, because the judge might not be sympathetic to debtors, but he's also not going to appreciate having his docket used to push a foreclosure that's already been resolved." Voss looked at him. Something moved in those pale eyes. Not defeat, not yet. A man like Voss didn't do defeat quickly or cleanly. But something shifted, a recalculation. The specific look of a man who has been playing a long game and has arrived at a position he didn't expect and needs time to assess. "We're done here today," Boone said. "You can leave." The word leave had no heat in it. It was simply the accurate description of what Voss's only available option was, delivered without drama. Voss sat in the surrey for another moment. Then he picked up the reins and turned the horse, and his riders fell in behind him, and the banker followed, and they rode back through the gate and down the road, and the sound of them faded into the cold December air. Marin stood on the porch after they were gone. She hadn't moved. Clara's hand was still on Eli's shoulder. Then Eli said very quietly, "Did we win?" Nobody answered for a moment. "Yeah," Boone said. "We won today." Eli made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a held breath releasing, and Clara pulled him sideways into a hug that he resisted for exactly 1 second before giving into it. Marin came down off the porch. She stopped in front of Boone in the yard, about the same distance he'd kept from her since the first night, and she looked at him with something in her face that was too complicated to be one thing. There was gratitude in it. There was grief in it too. The specific grief of someone who knows that accepting this means understanding what it cost. And underneath both of those, a fierceness that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with what a person looks like when they have been close to losing everything and have not. "I need you to know," she said, "that I know what you did, the full weight of it. I'm not going to pretend I don't." "All right," he said. And I need you to know that I intend to give it back, she said. Not, she stopped, not the money specifically. You'll have the money, but what it means, what you gave up. Her voice was steady, and her eyes were steady, and she was not going to cry in her front yard in front of her children. I intend for that to mean something. He looked at her. It already does, he said. She held the look for a moment longer. Then she reached out and put her hand on his arm. Just briefly, just a touch. The weight of it, nothing measured in physical terms, and considerable measured in everything else. And then she let go. Come inside, she said. I'll make coffee. Real coffee. I've been saving it. You keep saying that about the coffee, he said. I keep having reasons to use it, she said. She went up the porch steps and in through the door, and Clara followed, pulling Eli by the hand. Boone stood in the yard a moment longer. He put his hand in his coat pocket where the receipt was and felt the folded paper there. The money was gone. Thomas and Rosie were still at their grandmother's house, still waiting, the timeline still uncertain in ways that were going to require him to sit down and think through with a clear head and some time, and probably a conversation with himself he hadn't had yet. But the receipt was in his pocket, and the ranch was behind him, standing in the winter light with its repaired fence and its turning windmill and its barn roof that would hold through the season. And somewhere inside, a pot of real coffee was going onto the stove. He walked up the porch steps and went inside. Fitch filed the dismissal motion before the week was out, as promised. Judge Price granted it on a Wednesday, with the terse efficiency of a man who has reviewed the facts and found no remaining basis for the petition. Voss's men did not come back to the ranch. Voss himself was seen in Hadley twice in the following week, and both times he did not ride in the direction of the Callaway property. Word got around. It always did on the frontier, the same way Devers had known about Marin and Fitch had known about the Kettle River family, and the boy from the neighboring spread had known about Voss's trip to the county recorder. The territory was cold and vast and felt empty, but its people were connected in the way that isolated people always are, by the movement of information across distances, carried by whoever was riding in that direction. What spread was simple. A trapper named Mercer had paid a widow's debt, had used everything he had, and Gideon Voss, who had come to the Callaway Ranch with armed riders and legal documents and a banker, had ridden away with nothing. Boone didn't know what was spreading. He was splitting firewood one morning, 4 days after Voss's last visit, when he heard a wagon on the road, and looked up to see it wasn't Voss's surrey and wasn't Devers' trading post rig. It was a farm wagon, driven by a man he didn't know, with a woman beside him and a load of something in the back covered by a canvas tarp. The man pulled up at the gate and looked over at Boone. Callaway place? He said. That's right, Boone said. The man nodded and climbed down from the wagon. Harmon Plett, he said. We're out of the Creole Valley. 12 miles. He gestured at the wagon. Got some things. What kind of things? Boone said. Plett pulled the canvas back. Under it was a load of winter feed, 2 full sacks of cornmeal, a box of dry goods, and a tightly bundled roll of fencing wire. Boone looked at it. Why? He said. Plett looked at him. He was a big man, wide through the shoulders, with the patient, permanent tan of someone who works outdoors from first thaw to first freeze. Because Voss pushed my cousin off his land 2 seasons back, Plett said. And I didn't do anything about it, because I didn't think there was anything to do. He held Boone's look. Then I heard there was. He carried the goods to the barn without being asked, with the careful efficiency of a man who has driven 12 miles with a specific purpose and isn't interested in ceremony. His wife came down from the wagon too and brought a covered pot that turned out to contain a full ham, cooked, wrapped in cloth. By the time Boone had gotten Marin from the house, Plett was already back on his wagon and picking up the reins. I don't know how to thank you, Marin said. Don't, Plett said. We're neighbors, 12 miles or not. He looked at Boone. You need anything else, you send word to Creole Valley. He drove out, and Marin stood in the yard looking at the gate after him, and Boone stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. They were still standing there when another wagon appeared on the road. The second wagon belonged to a family named Cutler, a husband and wife and their grown son who had a farm 7 miles east along the creek road. They brought lumber, good lumber, milled and stacked and tied with rope, the kind that didn't come cheap even in summer. The sun climbed down before the wagon fully stopped and started untying the load without waiting to be asked. And the father came to the gate with his hat in his hand and told Marin that he'd heard what happened, and he'd had that lumber sitting since August waiting on a project that kept not getting done. And she might as well have it. Marin thanked him in the careful way of someone who is holding themselves together by concentrating on each individual word. The Cutlers stayed for an hour. By the time they left, a man named Garvey had arrived from the North Road with 2 young steers that he said were surplus, and that everyone present understood were not surplus. He shook Boone's hand without saying much, and led the steers to the south pasture and latched the gate behind them and drove back the way he'd come. Boone stood in the yard and watched all of this with the particular feeling of a man who has done something in private and is watching it become public in ways he didn't anticipate and isn't entirely comfortable with. He hadn't done it for this. He'd done it because the number had been right there, and the alternative was something he couldn't live with. And the crowd gathering in Marin's yard with their lumber and their steers and their covered pots felt like something larger than what he'd intended to set in motion. But that was the thing about the frontier. Things moved in ways you didn't control. You dropped a stone in still water and the rings went out to the edge and you couldn't call them back. By late afternoon, there were 11 people on the property. By the following morning, there were more. Word had moved through the valley the way it always moved, person to person, wagon to wagon, carried by whoever was heading in that direction. And what it carried was not just the story of a debt paid, but something underneath the story, something people had been carrying quietly for a long time and had not had a specific place to put. Gideon Voss had been working this territory for years. He'd taken the Kettle River property. He'd pushed 2 other families out through the same slow machinery of debt and procedure and the particular pressure of a man who controls the money and the legal apparatus both. People had watched it happen. People had felt the shadow of it on their own land, their own notes, their own futures. They hadn't done anything because there was nothing obvious to do, and because when a man like Voss comes for you, the most rational thing is to keep your head down and hope he goes elsewhere. But now Voss had come for Marin Calloway, and a trapper had put everything he had on the ground between them, and somehow that specific act had broken something loose, had said, in language that needed no translation, that there was a different way to respond. Fitch came out on the second day. He arrived in his rickety buggy, looking slightly overwhelmed and carrying a ledger, and he sat at Marin's kitchen table, surrounded by people he mostly knew from their legal problems, and tallied up what had been brought. The number surprised everyone, including Fitch. Feed, livestock, lumber, dry goods, tools, a new plow blade contributed by someone who'd bought 2 at the end of last season and had been storing the extra. A bolt of good wool cloth from Mrs. Halverson, who had come herself despite the 12-mile ride, and sat in Marin's kitchen drinking coffee and saying very little, but with a specific warmth in her expression that communicated plenty. 3 men from the Creole Valley had come back with Harmon Plett the second day, this time with tools and the intention to work, and they'd spent the afternoon patching the last of the barn's weak spots and building out a proper wood shelter on the east side of the house that would make the winter supply situation considerably less precarious. At the end of the tally, Fitch set his pen down and looked at the ledger and then at Boone, who was sitting at the far end of the table with a coffee cup and the look of a man who is present but slightly removed from what's happening around him. "There's enough here," Fitch said carefully, "that if we liquidate the right portions, we're looking at somewhere close to $300 in recoverable value." The table was quiet for a moment. "That's not mine," Boone said. "No one said it was," Fitch said. "But there's a conversation to be had about what you're owed and what form that takes." "It takes the form of Marin keeping what her neighbors brought her," Boone said. "That's what it takes." Marin, who was standing at the stove, turned around. "Boone," she said. "It's not negotiable," he said, not unkindly. "That's not charity to you. That's your neighbors deciding they were tired of watching Voss win." Fitch tapped his pen on the ledger. "What I'm trying to say, Mr. Mercer, is that there are people in this room and people who have come through this room in the past 2 days who are aware of what you gave up. And they would like, if you'll allow it, to participate in returning some portion of it." Boone looked at the lawyer. Fitch reached into his coat and put an envelope on the table. "This represents individual contributions from 11 families. I won't tell you the names unless you ask, because some of them would prefer you didn't know." He paused. "It's not everything," It's not close to everything, but it's a start. Boone didn't pick up the envelope. How much? He said. $140, Fitch said. The table was very quiet. $140 didn't replace 2 years of pelts. It didn't close the gap between where Boone was now and where he'd been on the morning he rode into town with the bundle behind his saddle. But it was not nothing. $140 was a season's head start. It was the difference between starting over from zero and starting over from somewhere. He looked at the envelope. He thought about Thomas with his arms crossed in the spring light. He thought about Rosie and her rag doll. He picked up the envelope. "Tell them thank you," he said. His voice came out lower than he'd intended. Fitch nodded. "I will." Marin looked at Boone from across the kitchen with something in her face that she didn't try to put into words, and he looked back at her, and that was enough. The days between Christmas and the New Year had a particular quality on the frontier: the deepest cold, the shortest light, the sense of being inside something that has no intention of releasing you yet. But on the Callaway Ranch, those days had a different texture than they'd had in years. People came and went. Work got done in the communal, slightly chaotic way that work gets done when there are more hands than coordination, which meant some things got done twice and other things got skipped. But the net result was a property that had changed so substantially from what it had been in November that Marin sometimes stood in the yard and looked at it with a feeling that was close to disorientation. The wood shelter was solid. The barn was the best it had been since Daniel built it. The south pasture had proper fencing now, contributed by the Cutler boy who turned out to have a gift for it, straight lines and tight corners, the kind of fence that lasts. The 2 steers from Garvey were acclimating in the pasture alongside Marin's original cattle, and the combined herd looked like something a functioning ranch would have rather than a dying one. Eli learned to whistle through his teeth on December 28th. He did it standing by the water pump in the side yard, alone, in the late afternoon when he thought nobody was watching. A clear, sustained note, not perfect, slightly breathy at the edges, but absolutely a whistle. He stopped, did it again. Then he turned and ran for the barn where Boone was working, and the shout he let out crossing the yard was the pure, uncomplicated sound of a child who has finally managed the thing he'd been trying to manage. Boone heard the whistle demonstrated 4 times in a row and said that was the real thing, no question, and Eli spent the rest of the evening demonstrating it to Clara, who said it was acceptable, and to Marin, who said it was wonderful and meant it, and to Biscuit, who turned his good ear toward it and thumped his tail once on the floor, which Eli interpreted as approval. That night, after the children were in bed, Boone told Marin he was going to write to his mother-in-law. They were at the table where they ended up most evenings. It had become the place where the day got processed, where things that didn't have room elsewhere found room. Marin was mending. Boone was working through a length of harness that needed attention. The fire was right. The house was warm in the way it was warm now, reliably, which was different from how it had been in November. "To tell her what?" Marin asked. "To tell her I'm coming in the spring," he said. "To get Thomas and Rosie." Marin set down her mending. "Spring," she said. "March, maybe April, depending on the pass." He kept his eyes on the harness leather. "I need to go back up the mountain before that. Get what I can before the season closes. I won't build back to where I was, but I'll have something." He paused. "Enough for a start." Marin was quiet for a moment. "And then?" He looked up. "And then I bring them home," he said. The word home settled into the kitchen. Neither of them addressed it directly. It was the kind of word that carried more than one meaning depending on which angle you looked at it from, and both of them understood that, and neither of them was ready yet to look at it straight. "They'll need somewhere to be," Marin said carefully, "when you bring them back, while you're getting established." "I know." "I have 2 extra rooms," she said, in the same careful tone. "That's all I'm saying? If it's useful while you figure out the next step." He looked at her. She looked back at him with an expression that was both offering something and holding something back. The face of a person who has learned to be precise about what they're saying and what they're not saying. "Marin, don't make it complicated," she said. "You have nowhere to bring them to yet. I have rooms. Clara and Eli would—" She stopped, steadied. "My children have done nothing but ask about Thomas and Rosie since you mentioned their names. That's all I'm saying." He was quiet for a moment. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I asked, she said, and picked up her mending again. He thought about it for 3 days. He didn't think in circles the way he had about the pelts. This thinking had a different quality, quieter, less about arithmetic and more about something harder to calculate. What it meant to bring his children into a space that wasn't his. What it meant to be in that space himself. What he was willing to want after 2 years of wanting only one thing and now finding that one thing complicated by a kitchen table and a fire that drew properly and a boy who had finally learned to whistle. On the 3rd day, he sat down and wrote 2 letters. The first was to his mother-in-law, telling her he was coming in the spring and that Thomas and Rosie should know. The second was shorter, and he wrote it carefully, crossing out 2 lines and starting again, and when he was done it said what he meant without saying more than he was ready to say, which was that there was a ranch in the Hadley Valley that would have room for them when he arrived back, and that the family there were good people, and that he hoped she would trust his judgment on this as she had trusted it before. He sealed both letters and gave them to Plett's boy, who was riding north the following morning. January moved through slowly, the way January always does on the frontier, one gray day after another, the cold becoming a constant rather than a condition, the work contracting to what was essential because anything beyond essential cost too much to sustain. Boone went back up the mountain for 3 weeks in the middle of the month. He left before dawn on a morning so cold the air had a visible density to it, and Marin walked out to the gate with him carrying 2 cups of coffee and handed him one without a word. He took it. They stood at the gate in the dark, drinking coffee, not talking until the cold made standing still impractical. "Be careful," she said. "Always am," he said. She looked at him with the expression that was becoming familiar, the one that held more than it showed. "No, you're not," she said, "but be careful anyway." He rode out. He worked the upper mountain for 3 weeks in conditions that reminded him daily that the frontier's indifference to human plans was absolute and unconditional. He lost 2 traps to a rock slide. He spent one night in a snow shelter he built himself when the temperature dropped faster than expected, and going back was not an option. He found good territory on the north-facing slopes, and he worked it with the methodical patience of a man who has nothing but time and the specific motivation of knowing exactly what the work is for. When he came back down, he had enough to matter. Not what he'd had before, but enough to build on, which was a different kind of enough, and not nothing. He rode back into the Callaway yard on a Tuesday afternoon in late January to find Eli on the gate rail watching the road. The boy saw him coming and jumped down and ran for the house yelling that Boone was back, and by the time Boone reached the gate, Clara was on the porch and Marin was at the door, and the specific quality of the welcome, uncomplicated, immediate, the welcome of people who had been waiting and were not embarrassed to show it, hit him somewhere in the chest in a way he hadn't prepared for. He unsaddled his horse and told Eli about the snow shelter and let Clara inspect the new pelts with the critical eye she'd apparently developed for this purpose. And when he came inside, the kitchen was warm and there was food on the stove, and Biscuit came and put his gray muzzle on Boone's knee and stayed there. Marin looked at him across the kitchen. "Good trip?" she said. "Good enough," he said. She nodded, went back to the stove, and that was all. And it was exactly right. February brought a letter back from his mother-in-law. It was brief, as her letters always were. She was a woman who used words the way she used money, carefully and without excess. She said Thomas had gone quiet when he'd heard Boone was coming. She said Rosie had asked every day since what month was March, and how many days was that, and whether that was soon. She said she would have them ready, and she would trust his judgment, as she always had, even when she didn't fully understand it. He read the letter twice and put it in his coat pocket and went out to split wood, because there are feelings that need physical work to get through, and grief and gratitude and the specific ache of time that can't be recovered are all in that category. Marin found him an hour later, still splitting, long past what the wood supply required. She didn't say anything. She sat on the splitting stump off to the side and watched him work until the rhythm slowed on its own and he stopped. "They're all right," he said. Not to her specifically, just out loud. "I know," she said. "I was gone too long." "Yes," she said. She didn't soften it. He didn't want it softened. "I'm going to get them," he said, "and it's going to take time to make things right with them. Thomas especially. He's old enough to have opinions about it. He set the axe down. I don't know exactly what that looks like. Nobody does, she said. You figure it out as you go. He looked at her. How did you do it? He said. After Daniel. How did you keep going with them when you were... He paused. When you had nothing left. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the split wood stacked against the fence. I didn't always, she said. There were days I gave them cornmeal porridge and sat in the chair by the stove and didn't get up until noon. There were days Clara made her own lunch because I couldn't. She paused. And then I got up because I had to. Not because I felt like it. Because the cows needed milking and the fire needed wood, and those two kids needed something I was the only one there to give them. She looked at him. That's the whole answer. There's no better one. He picked the axe back up and hung it on the fence hook. Thomas and Rosie are going to like it here, he said. I know they are, she said. Eli's going to drive Thomas crazy. Eli drives everyone crazy, she said. It's a skill. The almost smile came to her face again, the one that was becoming a real smile more often lately. Claire's going to want to be in charge of everything. She already is in charge of everything, Boone said. She gets that from someone, Marin said, and stood up from the stump and went back inside. He left for the northern pass in late March, when the snow had softened enough to travel, but the passes were still hard work. Marin and the children came to the gate. Eli was red-faced from not crying and not doing a particularly good job of it. Clara stood straight and gave him a look that said she expected him to come back and would consider anything else a personal failing. Marin stood slightly apart from the children and looked at him in the morning light. How long? She said. 3 weeks, he said. Maybe 4, depending on the pass and the weather on the other side. She nodded. She reached into her coat pocket and took out something small and put it in his hand. He looked at it. A piece of folded paper. For Thomas, she said. If he'll take it. He put it in his pocket without reading it. He understood it was not for him. He rode out through the gate, and when he was far enough down the road that looking back was a choice rather than an accident, he made the choice, and they were still there. Eli on the fence rail, despite being told not to, Clara with her arms crossed, Marin with one hand raised once, brief, and then lowered. He turned back to the road and rode north. He found Thomas and Rosie at their grandmother's house on an afternoon when the sky beyond the northern peaks was the specific blue of late winter becoming spring, hard and clean and without compromise. His mother-in-law met him at the door with the expression of a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was ready to set it down. She told him the children were out back and she would give them a moment, and went inside without waiting for his answer. He walked around the side of the house. Rosie saw him first. She was sitting on a fence post with her rag doll. Older now, the doll, patched in 2 places since he'd last seen it, and she went still when she saw him, the way children go still when something they've been expecting finally arrives, and the reality of it is different from the idea of it. Then she got off the fence post and walked toward him. Not running. Walking, with a deliberateness that was too careful for 7 years old and broke his heart in exactly the way he'd known it would. He crouched down and she walked into him, and he held her, and she was bigger than he remembered, which was the worst part about absence. The way the people you love keep changing without you, and you only find out all at once. You smell different, she said into his shoulder. Different how? Like wood smoke, she said, and horses. But different horses. I've been on a ranch, he said. Thomas was across the yard by the water barrel, looking at him the way Boone had known he would, with the crossed arms and the set jaw and the careful, withheld expression of a 9-year-old who has decided that feelings are negotiable and he has not yet agreed to the terms. He looked like his mother in that moment, a fact that was both beautiful and difficult. Boone looked at his son across the yard. I know, Boone said. He didn't say what he knew. He didn't need to. Thomas was 9, not 6. He understood. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Then he uncrossed his arms, not all the way, just a loosening, a small concession. You're actually here, Thomas said. I'm actually here, Boone said. For real this time. For real, Boone said. I'm not going back without you. Thomas looked at his boots, then at Boone. Then something gave way in his face. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way a river doesn't break through a dam all at once, but finds the small places first. And he crossed the yard, and Boone caught him with one arm while the other still held Rosie. And he stayed crouched in the dirt of his mother-in-law's yard holding both of them and not saying anything because there was nothing to say that was better than this. After a while, Rosie said, "Where are we going?" "South," Boone said. "Hadley Valley. There's a ranch there." "Is it ours?" Thomas asked. His voice was muffled in Boone's coat. Boone paused. It was a fair question, and it deserved a fair answer. "Not yet," he said. "But there are people there who are going to feel like family while we work on that part." He paused. "There's a boy named Eli who is 6 and talks too much, and a girl named Clara who is 8 and has opinions about everything." "I have opinions about things," Rosie said. "I know you do," Boone said. "You and Clara are going to get along fine." Thomas pulled back slightly. "And the people who live there, do they know we're coming?" Boone reached into his coat pocket and took out the piece of paper Marin had given him. He held it out to Thomas. "This is from the woman who lives there. Her name is Marin." Thomas looked at the paper. He unfolded it with the careful deliberateness he did most things with, and read it with the reading concentration of a 9-year-old who takes words seriously. His expression while he read it didn't give much away. When he was done, he folded it back up along its creases and held it. "What does it say?" Rosie asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "It says we have a place to come home to," he said. He put the paper in his own pocket, which was answer enough. They arrived at the Callaway Ranch on a morning in late April, when the prairie had gone green overnight the way it does in spring, suddenly and completely, as if it had been waiting for a specific moment and had chosen this one. The cottonwood was in leaf. The windmill was turning in a light southern wind. The cattle were in the south pasture, the new steers alongside the old, and the fence around them was straight and tight. Eli saw them coming from his post on the gate rail and let out a sound that scattered the closest cattle and brought Clara at a run from the house and Marin to the door with flour on her hands from whatever she was making. Rosie climbed down from the horse and looked at the ranch with the assessing, quiet look she'd been using on the whole journey south, cataloging things before she decided what she thought about them. She looked at the windmill, the barn, the house with its smoke coming from the chimney, Biscuit, who had come to the gate to investigate and was now sitting with his gray muzzle pointed at the new arrivals. "Is that your dog?" she asked Eli. Eli looked at Biscuit. "He's sort of everybody's," he said. Rosie walked up to Biscuit and let him smell her hand and then scratched him behind his good ear. And Biscuit closed his eyes and leaned into it with the full commitment of an old dog who has decided to trust someone. And Rosie's face did the thing that Boone had been waiting to see it do for 4 weeks of traveling. It relaxed, completely, into something that was simply a child being comfortable in a place. Thomas stayed on the horse a moment longer than the others. He looked at the ranch with his careful eyes, taking in the fence and the barn and the repaired roof pitch and the windmill and all the visible evidence of work done and sustained. Then he looked at Boone. "You built this?" he said. "I helped," Boone said. "Mostly it was already here. Someone else built it, a long time ago. We just kept it standing." Thomas looked at the house. Marin had come down from the porch and was walking toward them across the yard, wiping flour from her hands on her apron, and there was something in the way she walked, unhurried, direct, no performance in it, that Thomas apparently registered, because some of the careful watchfulness in his expression shifted into something more like assessment, which was a step closer to openness than he'd managed with most things. Marin stopped a few feet away and looked at Thomas with the same directness she looked at everything. "You look like your father," she said. Thomas blinked. He hadn't expected that. "Around the eyes," she said, "and the way you stand." Thomas considered this. "Is that good?" he asked. "It's a fact," she said. "Whether it's good is up to you." She held out her hand. He shook it, which was not what most adults expected from a 9-year-old, but Marin didn't look surprised. "Come inside. There's food, and you've been traveling for weeks." She walked back to the house, and Thomas watched her go. Then he climbed down from the horse. What happened over the following weeks was not smooth. It was not the easy assembling of a ready-made family, because that is not how people work, and it is not how children work, and it is certainly not how Thomas Mercer, 9 years old, with a year of stored grievance and a legitimate case against the concept of patience, worked. There were hard days. There were meals where nobody talked much and the silence had weight in it. There was an afternoon in May where Thomas and Eli had a fight about something minor that was really about something else entirely, and Clara intervened with the authority of someone who had been managing emotional situations for 2 years and had strong opinions about how they should be handled, which did not improve the situation. Boone let most of it work itself out. Marin did the same. They had both been parents long enough to know that intervention has its place and its non-place, and that children sorting out their own positions in a new arrangement need space more than they need management. What helped, in the end, was work. Boone took Thomas out on the range in the mornings with the same unhurried approach he'd used with Eli, and Thomas, who had his father's patience when he chose to use it, turned out to be good with cattle in a way that surprised both of them. Clara taught Rosie her letters on the slate board with the serious, slightly overbearing pedagogy of an 8-year-old who takes education extremely seriously, and Rosie, who had her own opinions and communicated them clearly, somehow flourished under this rather than resisting it. Eli taught Thomas to whistle through his teeth, a skill he now considered himself an expert in, and Thomas mastered it in 2 days, which Eli found both impressive and slightly annoying. Boone and Marin didn't talk about what they were to each other for a long time. They didn't need to, in the practical sense. The ranch ran. The children grew. The days had their rhythm, and the evenings had their kitchen table and their fire, and the particular warmth of that space had expanded to hold more people without losing whatever it had been in the beginning. One evening in late May, after both sets of children were in bed, a fact that still required occasional verification because Eli and Rosie had discovered a shared talent for appearing to be asleep while being entirely awake. Boone sat at the table with his coffee and a length of leather he was braiding into something for Thomas's saddle, and Marin sat across from him with the account ledger, which was looking better than it had in 3 years. Fitch says the Halverson note is transferable, she said, if we wanted to expand the south pasture. That's a big if, Boone said. It's a conversation, she said. He braided the leather. She ran numbers. The fire was right. After a while, she closed the ledger. Boone, she said. He looked up. What are we doing? She said. Not with anxiety, with the directness she brought to everything that mattered. He set the leather down. He thought about the question. He thought about all the ways it could be answered and all the ways those answers were connected to what kind of man he wanted to be and what kind of story he wanted Thomas and Rosie to grow up inside of. I think, he said slowly, that we're building something. What kind of something? He looked at her across the table, at the face that had become, over 6 months of frontier winter and legal fights and early mornings and late evenings, one of the most familiar things in his life. The permanent kind, he said. If you want that. She held his eyes for a moment. There was a long pause that had nothing uncomfortable in it. I want that, she said. He picked up the leather again. She opened the ledger again. Outside the window, the prairie was dark and wide and full of the particular silence that comes when the wind has decided to rest, and the stars over the mountain were dense and close. And inside the house, the fire made its small sounds, and neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed to be said. The morning that stayed with Boone, the one he'd carry with him for years, when he tried to point to the moment when everything became real, wasn't dramatic. It was ordinary in the way that the best moments often are, which is to say it would have looked like nothing to anyone who wasn't inside it. It was a June morning, early, the light still pale. He was out at the corral checking the fence posts when he heard the sound behind him. 3 separate sets of footsteps on the porch, and then Eli's whistle, and then Thomas answering it, and then Rosie saying something he couldn't quite hear that made Clara laugh. He turned around. All 4 of them were on the porch. Marin appeared in the doorway behind them with a coffee cup, looked out at the morning, looked at him across the yard. The sunlight came over the eastern ridge and caught the windmill turning in the early breeze, and the cattle were moving in the south pasture, and the cottonwood was in full summer leaf, and the fence line ran straight and tight to the horizon. He stood at the corral and took all of it in. Not because it was perfect. It wasn't. There was a post that needed resetting on the near side, and the north pasture gate was sticking again, and they still hadn't resolved the question of the Halverson acreage, and Thomas was going to need new boots before fall, and the work was never actually done. It just changed form, which was the nature of a ranch and the nature of a life, and the thing Daniel Calloway had known when he'd built this place, and the thing Boone was only now beginning to fully understand. The work was never done. But the people doing it, that was the part you chose. He'd come here with an axe and a pack, and 2 years of loneliness, and a number he was trying to reach, and somewhere between the first night's thin broth and a dead man's fence, and a legal fight, and a kitchen table, and a boy learning to whistle, he'd found the thing he hadn't known he was looking for. It wasn't the home he'd saved, it was the one he'd stayed for. He walked back toward the house, and the morning was cold and clear and full of the small, ordinary sounds of a family beginning another day, and that was everything.